El tema de mi ponencia parece un poco desviado porque no ofrezco un análisis de una estrella ni un conjunto de estrellas españolas, sino propongo un marco para pensar en el trabajo que hacían los espectadores y fans en relación a las estrellas. Así que me centraré en las intensidades afectivas o la economía de la afectividad, es decir, el ámbito en el que se consumía, amaba y lloraba y sentía a causa de y por medio de las estrellas. Este marco se concibió primero en el capítulo de nuestro proyecto Cinema and Everyday Life in 1940s and 50s Spain, en Oral History, para el cual entrevistamos a 125 personas que asistían al cine en los 40 y 50 y que se autodefinían como cinéfilos, fans o amantes del cine. Originalmente habíamos explicado estos procesos en términos de identificación, pero nuestro planteamiento fue evolucionándose según vimos más ejemplos de afectividad intensa y tratamos de determinar qué papel jugaban estas expresiones emotivas en un paisaje de carencia, pobreza económica, física y emocional que no obstante ofrecía estos portales o nodos a un mundo de plenitud, es decir, los cines, en los que se podía enchufar en un mundo virtual en el que se experimentaba la transformación emocional y física. Hoy presentaré parte del capítulo en construcción que he estado escribiendo en colaboración con Katie Vernon, que se titula The Effective Economy of Spectatorship. Hablaré de cómo el marco de la labor afectiva nos ayuda a entender primero cómo las fans gestionaban las emociones y las estrellas que circulaban en el espectáculo del cine. Segundo, lo que hacían las fans para resistir o apropiarse creativamente de la relación con las estrellas, que fue manipulada y promovida por las industrias de la cultura mediática cinematográfica. Y tercero, cómo este marco del trabajo y la economía del espectáculo permite entrever una forma de labor consumista que ya estaba en juego a finales de los 20 y principios de los 30 en la cultura del cine y que se ha multiplicado a escala masiva en la era digital. Un fan labor, o sea, trabajo por parte del espectador, que no es tan nuevo, pero sí requiere que indaguemos en sus manifestaciones anteriores y por lo tanto hagamos una incursión en anacronismos teóricos. Como indiqué anteriormente, mi análisis incluye tres ideas principales, que son primero interfaz, segundo emoción e intensidades afectivas, tercero la labor en el sentido del trabajo, el esfuerzo y la producción por parte de los espectadores. Y aquí les pido perdón porque voy a cambiar al inglés y entonces va a haber más labor, lo siento. La próxima, por favor. What impacted me the most when I first listened to these interviews and what continues to fascinate me to this day was the tremendous power of cinema on these individuals and their sophisticated articulation of it, oftentimes in terms more gripping than the most famous theorizations of cinema over the course of the 20th century. Cinema, according to these fans, was everything, even life itself. According to Manuel, el cine es la magia de mi generación. El cine te hace soñar. El cine te hace vivir. Todo el mundo se sumerge en el cine. El cine es la ilusión, era la forma de proyectarte. Por José María, el cine lo llevamos más como una carpeta debajo del brazo, que era nuestro, y había un mundo. No, iba con nosotros, no está al margen, vive con nosotros, y lo siento vivir a mi lado. No es una escapatoria, es una vivencia, está y forma parte de nosotros. In the spectatorial moment, the divide between screen and reality dissolved, immersing the spectator and forming what Edgar Morin defined as a dialectic of imaginary and practical influences. In this highly mediated assemblage of body and technology, the interface pressed upon, touched, and left its mark on spectators. In the memories of our interviewees, cinema and reality were fused. La próxima, por favor. José María remembers cinema goers expressing their reaction with oleadas de risa o susto o pasmo. Upon shutting one's eyes, you could perceive el latido de la película, risas o suspiros hondos. El público estaba viviendo entrañablemente los acontecimientos de la película. In the same moment that some described this merging of the real and the imaginary, interviewees referenced the viscerality of the cinematic experience. As Manuel said, te metes en la sala, empiezas a vivir, se te mete por las venas. Era quedar dentro del drama. After seeing a Western, salía cabalgando del cine. The ebb and flow of relational and affective intensities that we heard in the interviews is inseparable from any understanding of identification. Yet identification as a term, with its connotation of scopic identification and understanding of cinema watching, was not expansive enough to accommodate both affect and the economy of spectatorship, and in particular, the relation of spectator and interface as a fluid model of mediation, an event that is in becoming. I therefore employ a model of cinema going that sees interface and spectator as operating in a nexus of conceptual, affective, and multisensorial affective flows. La próxima, por favor. Emotions, affective intensities. In what has been called the affective turn, cinema and cultural theorists have outlined important distinctions between cognitive theories of emotion versus affect. For Sarah Ahmed, emotions are relational. Like the mediated spectatorship that I have just described, Ahmed does not see emotion as existing in either the individual or the social or the text, but is circulating amongst them. Emotions are crucial to the very constitution of the psychic and the social as objects. In other words, the spectator becomes through cohabitation with these affecting circulating objects. More than contagion, Ahmed argues, the I and the we are shaped by and through emotions, and thus they are the effect rather than the cause of emotions. We can see how subjectivity takes effect through emotions in Isidro's recounting of his witnessing of the audience of a film standing and crying in unison. Vi una cosa en el cine que nunca había visto. Al final de la película, el público llorando y de pie. Or Julia, who remembers contagious crying that provoked laughter in Valencia's Cine Versailles. Llevé a mi sobrina de 15 años a ver Taras Bulba y lloraba como una Magdalena y todos riéndose alrededor de ella y cuanto más reían, más lloraba. Te divertías, lo pasabas bien. In both of these instances, the public becomes a collaborative spectator, united and self-aware of the emotions impacting it. For Brian Masumi, emotion and affect belong to different logics. Emotion describes something that comes out of a subject or an object, and in that point onward, in that moving away from something, we define that emotion as personal, and thus we circumscribe it socially, deem it as owned or monetized. Affect, in contrast, is neither owned nor qualifiable nor recognizable, and is therefore resistant to critique or autonomous. Thus, the kind of affect that our interviewees invoke and make their own through recall and memory can allow us to envision, as I will argue in my conclusion, that the energy and labor invested in these affective intensities was inalienable or indissociable, neither branded nor taggable. In this sense, our interviews constitute a repository of visceral and embodied responses and instances of self-disclosure that, far from static and predetermined, offer an outlet for personal aspirations and even a tool for emotional survival. For Ernst Bloch, such a structure through which one could wish something much larger is a world-improving dream and the utopian shimmer of popular culture. Laughter and tears belong to the physiology of emotion that Juliana Bruno has described in tactile terms as the material basis of cinematic pathos. If the eye itself can caress and be caressed, then the cinematic experience is not one of spectator reaction to a remote stimulus, but rather a tactile vision and an optical touch. La próxima, por favor. The imprint of sentimentality on the body is poignantly recalled by Berta, a working class resident of Vallecas. At the end of a weepy, she and her friends were literally marked by their tears, black lines of mascara streaming down their faces. The mascara, the indexo, el rímel, the indexical trace of the cinema, had touched her. Do you remember? She asked the other interviewee. Que vergüenza. Was she embarrassed that her mascara ran, or that she had wept so freely? Or was she disimulando for the sake of social propriety so as to protect this emotionally saturated memory that she enjoys retelling to this day? Perhaps an awareness of collective affect performed in unison with other women was also registered by other spectators in the theater, manifesting a scenario with multiple registers of meaning. Whatever had been or would be, the streams of black mascara, the cinematic footprints, testified to the intensity of the experience. Even the gesture of retelling the moment of inscription offered significant emotional compensation, both in its moment and the present. The abundant release of tears or emotion was for many a kind of cleansing flood. Rather than emptying, the gushing actually allowed spectators with significant emotional purchase and a liquid return in both the English sense of liquidity and in the sense of emotional flow. When Milagros discussed one of her favorite films, Seguiré tu camino, she remembers listening to a recording of the soundtrack. Me lo ponía de noche y me hartaba de llorar. Después me puse un tango y me quedé desinflada, llorando todo lo que pude. Casi era bonito llorar. La gente piensa que llorar es malo. Yo pienso que llorar de vez en cuando, darte una buena, decir hoy me voy a poner a llorar porque es lo que necesito. Te quedas como nueva y no por nada malo. Seguiré tu camino era eso. Apologies, the slide wasn't complete. La próxima, por favor. Discussing her response to the Disney films Dumbo and Alice in Wonderland, Cristina remembers laughter and tears as emotion flowing out of her body, emoción que nos salía por los ojos, por la boca y por la nariz. The sisters Carmela and Ofelia recall, volvíamos con la cabeza así, cuando veía tantas películas me ponía borracha. As these memories suggest, tears and laughter are more than physical response to cinema going. They are a productive, mobile, embodied condition, and they are conduits between the real and the cinematic. Historically, this has meant seeing those who cry as hyperfeminine, hysterical, irrational, in contrast to colonizing masculinist and capitalist logics of surplus as rational. Women's tears have been viewed as overabundance, that which is uncontainable. In his work on male fantasies, Klaus Teweleit has identified a historically waged battle against women through science and philosophy to suppress female sexuality, which has been feared and denigrated in psychoanalytic terms as unconscious and uncontrollable flows of desire. He connects overflowing emotional expressions by men as territorializing actions that are legitimated. Men use their emotional flow, exploit it, and then control the channeling of any flow through women or representations of women, simultaneously denying women emotional power in public spheres and social production. Linda Williams and other film historians have shown that female film genres or women's films are implicated in a modality of surplus. These so-called weepies addressed women as hysterics whose bodies were receptacles of excess. Traditionally, Williams argues, the women's body was viewed as a vehicle for pleasure, fear, and pain, and was condemned as being deficient in cultural capital. There is so much more to say about how tears have been deployed against women or seen as the weapon of weakness, not to mention more recent decolonialized understandings of hormonal drives, which intersect with queer, anti-ageist, and anti-ableist perspectives. But for the sake of time, I will refrain from elaborating, and I will instead briefly mention what you all gathered here today already know, that during the Spanish post-war years, tears were coded as feminine to a greater and lesser degree, depending on political and cultural context. And yet, several of our male interviewees admitted to crying. Pepe is not alone in confessing that he was llorando como una Magdalena when he watched Cinema Paraíso, for it evoked powerful memories of what the cinema meant to him when he was young. Tears were not only enjoyed by men as well, but they constituted an active gestural language that supplements the silence of those who are cautious or inhibited. Cinema's dreamscapes adjusted the emotional deficit of repressed emotions, constrained desires, and resignation by offering its patrons an accessible, affordable way to invest in images that filled them, as they themselves put it, with ilusión. Cinema could distraer el hambre, as they said. Uno bebía del cine. La próxima, por favor. Labor. The stark, or emotional labor, the stark contrast between the economic, material, and emotional deprivation of many of our interviewees prompted us from the beginning of our project to parse out the meanings of the psychic economy of cinematic spectatorship at play in cinema going, which is a reference to Jackie Stacey. to envision an overlapping of what was imagined and lived, and to understand the cinema-going body in Francoist society as much more open and porous than we had imagined previously. For Manuel, no hay otra cosa. Las ciudades y los pueblos de España no tienen otra cosa. Es que España era muy tristona. Es que no había otra actividad de ningún tipo. Todo estaba prohibido. For Judith, la realidad era un aguafiestas y monótono. Uno iba al cine para distraerse un poco porque llevamos una vida bastante arrastrada, bastante gris. For Francisca fue un desahogo, un anhelo. And for Gloria, recordando las películas panorámicas de Cinescope, era una fiesta la panorámica. No la habíamos visto. Me quedé maravillada de ver todo aquello que llenaba la sala. The celebration that was the cinema poured into the theater. One could leave the gray monotony and drudgery of everyday life. No se podía comparar la realidad con la realidad que ofrecía el cine, que significaba no solo un vía de escape o un refugio, sino una manera de vivir más intensamente, de ver la existencia por medio de un foco más intensivo. Indeed, most cinema-goers had practically no money to spend nor much to buy. Nevertheless, the need to go outside of oneself, to invest in fantasy, to expend however surreptitiously or humbly, is a familiar human strategy for coping with lack, distress, or trauma, whether physical, emotional, or sociopolitical, and whether acute or not. We also found that cultural, symbolic, and emotional capital can sometimes supersede the importance of economic capital. According to James English, capital in this larger sense is anything that can be understood as an asset that can be profitably put to work in one or another domain of human endeavor. Capitalizing, we might say, on emotions, despite one's real life and actual conditions, involved tactics and activities such as engaging with emotions, accumulating surplus, imitating star labor, aspiring to and fantasizing about stars, acting out gestures, sympathizing or engaging with a character, re-semanticizing or producing alternative readings and meanings, projecting oneself, and experiencing forms of transcendence. But what is central to my argument is to frame all of these kinds of work through the concept of emotional labor. At stake was how or when to invest one's effective energy, which in turn depended upon where the boundaries of the real and the imaginary lay for that particular individual or the unique circumstances of her situation. Surplus acted as a supplement and even an emancipatory payoff. How much or little compensation was involved depended on context and the intersections with class, race, and gender. There was no singular process of identification, and one's proximity to the regime or experience of its disciplinary mechanisms had a direct impact on how much emotional labor one invested and how much of a return one hoped for. That is, how much they hoped they would enjoy it. At the same time, the filmic content and mechanism influenced how, when, and how much fans performed labor. The more labor they did, the more they seemed to enter into a different world, live it more, and feel it more. Returning to Carmela and Ofelia, the sisters, their comic experience of drunkenness, borracha, feeling borracha, was in addition to the feeling of plenty they already knew as upper middle class women. Their memory of Francoism was not economic deprivation. They were happy and had what they needed. Their satiation in the cinema was then an overabundance that didn't vindicate the trauma of poverty, but rather the aching for lives more like the modern cosmopolitan ones they saw in the movies and that they could never lead. In this sense, their case of surplus allowed for transgression, even if metaphorical. Their love of Hollywood reveals dissatisfaction with the accepted avenues of adulthood, namely their low opinion of Spanish men and their desire to be different from other girls, albeit in terms of good bad girls, in line with bourgeois values. Thus, the flow, abundance, and surplus that Carmela and Ofelia controlled offered a conceptually transgressive inebriation, which explained their intense emotional enjoyment and also the emotional labor they were performing by re-semanticizing, changing the meaning of borracha to mean not only sanctioned behavior, but uniquely their behavior, their inalienable emotion. And here I return to the concept of inalienable by Brian Masumi. The case of Maria offers a most beautiful example of redirecting emotion, but very different from Carmela and Ofelia. Maria's interview is also unique for another reason. For the majority of our interviewees, Spanish stars in cinema weren't as popular, as desired, or as interesting. They were too contrived, that is, Spanish stars in cinema. They were too enmeshed in regime politics and perhaps too familiar. Most preferred American stars. US female stars were mentioned twice as many times as Spanish ones, 60 in comparison to 32 times. Yet going by the numbers impoverishes any understanding of fans like Maria, who did connect with Spanish stars in cinema. In her words, and I want to play you a clip of Maria speaking because I want you to hear, actually, I want to center the voices of these interviewees. They're in their beautiful testimonies. So I really hope that this is going to work. And I'm going to play it. Please tell me if you can't hear anything. So I'm going to start it now.
Pero sí fui a ver algunas películas, sobre todo las españolas, causaron impacto porque en las que yo he visto españolas me gustaban muchísimo. Fíjate que la gente parece ser que está en contra del cine español, pues yo soy todo lo contrario, me gustaban mucho las películas españolas. Sí. Y concretamente vi una que todavía yo era soltera que me impresionó porque se titulaba Porque te vi llorar.
Ajá. Cuéntame algo de esta película.
Sí, trabajaba Luis Peña y Pastora Peña, que creo que son hermanos, porque luego había un Julio Peña, pero ese no era hermano de ellos, era coincidencia de apellido. Esa película me impactó muchísimo porque él era un hombre que era un obrero que estaba trabajando en una iglesia y fíjate, me recuerdo tanto esa película porque ya te digo que me impactó, me impresionó y lloré. Yo también, el título era Porque te vi llorar, pero yo también lloré. Y era...
Bueno, precioso. Y por favor, la siguiente. Ya. Aquí está la cita de María. Maria's strong identification with Spanish cinema and stars is also significant in light of her past, her family, and her politics. Yo venía de un nivel cultural muy bajo, she recalls, as she starts to cry. Mi padre trabajaba tanto para ponernos adelante. Por la política estábamos un poco discriminados, los de izquierdas, en los pueblos, y no ponían interés en nosotros, más bien nos ponían catequismo, catequismo, catequismo. This social alienation was encapsulated by a traumatic memory. The only teacher who had recognized the intellectual ability of her eldest brother was shot by the fascists. Twice during the interview, she mentioned her father, whom she was still mourning when the interview took place. Both times she mentioned her father, she began to cry, remembering what he had sacrificed to improve their situation. Maria associates her own tears with those shed by the protagonist of Porque te vi llorar. Her identification with the pain and suffering of the fascist-identified heroine provided her compensation because someone else had experienced the same level of anguish as her. To cathartically sob, to cry, while knowing the political differences between her and the character meant that she discarded what clashed with her political point of view. Maria was originally the main inspiration for our chapter because of her self-affirming disclosure. And as Katie Vernon wrote, her active rewriting of Porque te vi llorar, and I'm referring to the chapter Katie wrote with Manuel Palacios called Audiences in the Companion to Spanish Cinema, which was edited by Joe Lavagni and Tatiana Pavlovich. Resituating plot and characters to tend to her emotional needs, eliding details that didn't affirm them, Maria's heart-wrenching story shows how coping with the contradictions of capitalism sometimes requires adjusting our readings of texts and objects so as to make everyday reality more livable. At the same time, for Maria, there was no need to reconcile this contradiction. Tears as a productive force acted as a surplus that benefited someone whose capital had been limited to emotion. La próxima, por favor. In conclusion, what these individuals were doing with cinema was intensifying affective states, building effective connections through the interface, and finding deep gratification in dissolving it. In Francisca's words, ibas al cine para soñar de pie. Parecía como si te desinhibiera de tu vida, como meterte en la pantalla y decir, si yo fuera esa. Our interviewees were already articulating the blurring of labor and leisure that is the essence of the work we do when using social media and the digital interface. Analyzing the mechanisms of screen labor throughout Spain's history of star consumption, and when spectators could redirect emotional flows with their own agency, might lend valuable insight into our current dilemma in which our emotions, habits, and even thinking are, as we speak, monetized and made profitable. Muchísimas gracias.